Welcome to Sleepy Classic Tales. In tonight's episode, we present a calm, continuous retelling of The Stoker by Franz Kafka, first published in 1913. It is a story about power, powerlessness, and how quickly a person can lose their voice within an unfamiliar system. A young man arrives in America aboard a ship. It is his first journey, his first step toward a new life. He does not yet know what awaits him, but he is determined to find his way. While the ship lies in the harbor, he leaves his cabin and descends into the lower sections of the steamer. There, he encounters a stoker, a strong man, exhausted, covered in soot, visibly marked by hard labor. The stoker speaks to him urgently, not casually, but with desperation. It quickly becomes clear that he is about to lose his position. The stoker explains that he has been accused by a superior. He is charged with disobedience, negligence, even insubordination. He is said to have ignored orders, disturbed order, behaved disrespectfully. The stoker denies all of it. He states plainly that the accusations are false, invented to get rid of him. The young man listens carefully. He notices that the stoker struggles to express himself, that he drifts, repeats himself, loses his thread. But precisely this gives him credibility. He does not sound like someone trying to escape blame, but like someone speaking up for the first time in his life. The stoker says that he resisted unfair treatment, that he spoke up when things were wrong. That, he believes, is exactly what has now turned against him. In the ship's hierarchy, there is no place for dissent. Those who work below are expected to remain silent. The young man is shaken. He does not yet know this world, but he immediately senses that something fundamental is at stake. This is not just about a job. It is about whether a person is allowed to defend themselves, or whether every objection is treated as guilt. The stoker asks him for help, not for money, not for favors, only that someone listens, that someone carries his words upward. The young man hesitates. He does not know what role he can play, but he decides to accompany the stoker and go with him to the superior. He does not yet realize that this decision will draw him deeper into a system governed by its own rules. The young man and the stoker walk together through the narrow corridors of the ship. The farther they move away from the engine room, the cleaner the walls become, the quieter the surroundings. It feels as though they are not merely changing decks, but crossing a boundary from the world of labor into the world of decisions. The stoker stops in front of a door. Suddenly he appears uncertain, almost small. Not because he lacks strength, but because he knows what awaits him inside. Authority. A man who will not see him as a human being, but as a problem. They enter. Inside sits a superior, neat, controlled, unmoved. He barely looks up when they arrive. The stoker begins to speak, trying to present his case calmly. He says the accusations are false, that he has done his work, that he is being harassed. The superior listens, but not to understand. He listens in order to decide. His replies are brief, cold, formal. He speaks of rules, of discipline, of order on board. And he makes one thing clear. Those who object cause disruption. Then a third man is summoned, the direct superior who made the accusations. He appears confident, almost mocking. He speaks about the stoker, not to him. He calls him insubordinate, disrespectful, incapable of submission. He portrays him not as a victim, but as a danger. The The stoker tries to respond, but he becomes emotional, loses himself in details, speaks too quickly. And this is exactly what is used against him. Every sentence becomes evidence, not because he is lying, but because he cannot express himself in a language that counts in these rooms. The young man sees the injustice clearly. This is not about truth. It is about who appears more composed, who speaks calmly, who uses the correct terms. The stoker has no chance because the system denies him not only power, but expression. Still, the young man intervenes. He states plainly that he met the stoker below, that this man does not appear to be a troublemaker but someone desperately asking for justice. He insists that he be truly heard. For a moment, there is silence. The young man feels he has crossed a line. He is a passenger, a stranger, essentially uninvolved, and yet he has interfered. That has consequences. The superior now looks at him directly for the first time, and the young man realizes that he, too, is being assessed. The superior's gaze rests on the young man, not hostile, but measuring. He asks for his name, his destination, the reason for his presence on board. Everything sounds polite, yet it is a demonstration of power. The young man answers calmly, carefully. He senses that every word matters. The stoker stands beside him in silence, his hands clenched, his eyes restless. He knows this moment will decide his future. Not through what he himself says, but through the judgment of others. The accusing superior takes the opportunity to elaborate. He speaks of lack of discipline, of disrespect, of the danger such a man poses to operations. His words are smooth, orderly, convincing. He describes the stoker as someone who creates unrest, questions orders, refuses to fit in. The stoker tries to object. He says he merely pointed out problems, that he was treated unfairly, provoked. But the more he speaks, the clearer it becomes that his language carries no weight here. He repeats himself, grows louder, and in doing so, he confirms exactly the image being constructed of him. The young man understands how hopeless this situation is, not because the stoker is wrong, but because the system is built so that truth does not matter when it comes from below. Order matters more than justice, calm more than clarification. Still, the young man persists. He speaks again, more firmly. He says no clear guilt has been proven, that accusations alone cannot constitute a verdict, that one cannot simply remove someone for being inconvenient. These words do have an effect, not as compassion but as disturbance. The superior responds coolly. He explains that such decisions are not open for discussion, that hierarchy on board is clearly defined, and that a passenger would be wise not to interfere further. The atmosphere turns against the young man. Moments ago, he was an observer. Now, he is under suspicion himself. Not as a culprit, but as someone who questions rules. And that is dangerous here. A decision is made. The stoker is relieved of his post. Not immediately, not officially, but irrevocably. One speaks of reassignment, of review, harmless words that nevertheless mean the end. The stoker accepts it without protest, perhaps because he expected it, perhaps because he has long understood there is nothing to game here. As they leave the room together, descending the steps again, the young man realizes that this encounter was more than an isolated case. It was his first lesson in a new world. I began to understand that on this ship it was not about who was right, but about who was heard. And I was not being heard. The chief stoker spoke calmly, almost indifferently, dismantling my words one by one. He spoke of procedures, of order, of responsibilities. Everything sounded logical. Everything sounded final. My account suddenly appeared exaggerated, almost childish, as though I had created the injustice myself simply because I failed to understand it. I made one last attempt to explain. I said I had meant no harm, that I had only asked for justice, that the stoker below was no agitator, but a man who had worked under the same conditions for years and could no longer remain silent. But as I spoke, I realized my words were falling into emptiness. Not out of hostility, but out of indifference. The chief stoker nodded once, as if he had heard all that was necessary. Then he declared the matter closed. The stoker would be reassigned, the complaint acknowledged but without consequence. It sounded like a verdict that hurt no one, except the one who had hoped. I felt an uncomfortable mixture of shame and powerlessness. Not because I had failed, but because I understood how little my presence meant here. I was no part of this system. I was a stranger who had briefly believed he could change something. As we left the room, the stoker walked a few steps behind me. He said nothing. His face was tired but not surprised, as though he had expected this ending. Perhaps he had experienced it many times before. Perhaps that was why listening to him had been so difficult. In the corridor, I stopped, wanting to say something, an apology, a promise, anything. But he merely shook his head slightly, not reproachfully, but resigned. Then he turned and disappeared back toward the engine rooms, into heat, noise, and darkness. I remained behind, realizing that my first attempt to orient myself in this new world had already failed. Not because I had acted wrongly, but because I had believed justice alone would be enough. The farther I moved away from the engine room, the stranger the ship felt. Only moments earlier I had seen it as a place of departure, the beginning of something new. Now, it appeared as a closed system that carried me but did not truly receive me. I wandered aimlessly through corridors, past cabins, unfamiliar faces, voices that did not address me. No one spoke of the stoker. No one asked about him. I understood that this silence was not accidental, but part of the order. A quiet resistance stirred within me. Not loud, not heroic, more a muted unease. I wondered whether I had given up too soon, whether I should have stayed, whether I should have protested. But the longer I thought about it, the clearer it became that I possessed nothing with which to fight. No position, no authority, not even experience. I was new, and being new meant weakness. An officer passed me, looked me over briefly, and moved on as if I had already been categorized. In that moment, I understood that I, too, was already part of a plan I did not know. That my path was predetermined, not by malice, but by indifference. I thought again of the stoker, of his voice, of the hope in his face when I had listened. Perhaps he had believed that a stranger, someone without a past on board, might make a difference. Perhaps he had been wrong. Or perhaps he simply had nothing left to lose. I, however, still had something to lose. The illusion of freedom. Slowly I continued on my way, deeper into the ship, deeper into an order that asked no questions and expected no answers. And as I walked, it became clear to me that this was not only the story of a man below deck, but also the beginning of my own trial. Eventually, I was led into a large room, higher up, brighter, more orderly. Here it did not smell of oil and heat, but of paper, clothing, of a world that considered itself correct. Men stood together, spoke quietly, even laughed. None of them had ever set foot in the engine room. I was assigned a place without explanation. I waited. And while I waited, I felt what had just happened slowly fading. Not because it was unimportant, but because there was no space for it here. Then they began to speak about me, not to me, about me. They asked about my origin, my journey, my intentions. The questions were phrased politely, yet allowed no real answers. Every explanation was courteously received and just as courteously set aside. I realized my words were not being examined, but classified. The Stoker was not mentioned. I briefly considered bringing him up myself, but before I opened my mouth, I knew it would be pointless. Not because I was wrong, but because the subject did not exist here. It did not fit into this room, into this order. A man with a calm voice finally explained that my situation was understood, that they wished to help me, that opportunities existed for me if I adapted. His words sounded like an offer, but they were a decision. I felt something within me give way, not out of conviction, but out of fatigue, out of the desire not to stand out any longer, not to disturb. When I left the room, I knew the Stoker was already gone. Not physically, perhaps, but from every story that mattered here. And with him vanished the notion that justice in this place had anything to do with truth. I walked on through corridors, past people, but this time I was no longer the same. I had understood that on this ship one was not loudly oppressed. One was overlooked. And therein lay the real power. When the young man finally returned to the deck, the noise of the machines was only a distant rumble beneath his feet. The ocean lay calm, indifferent to everything that had taken place in the belly of the ship. He thought of the Stoker, of his words, of the way he had spoken, not pleading, not submissive, but with the simple certainty of being in the right. And yet that certainty had been useless. It had dissolved among responsibilities, orders, and the superior's desire to avoid unrest. The young man understood that this had never been about guilt or innocence. It had been about order, about a system meant to function smoothly, even if that meant silencing individuals. The Stoker had not been too loud. He had merely been inconvenient. Once more the young man looked toward the smokestack from which black smoke rose into the sky. Down below, the man was working still, or had already been sent away. He did not know. But he knew that he himself was now part of the same structure that had made this decision possible. The ship continued on its course, unwavering, purposeful. And somewhere deep beneath, someone was working whom no one wished to see. And with that, today's story comes to an end. Perhaps you are now wondering, how closely does our calm, short version remain to Franz Kafka's original text? Why does the Stoker remain nameless? And what does that say about his role in this world? And how typical is this story for Kafka, whose works so often revolve around powerlessness, hierarchy, and invisible guilt? We explore these and other questions in our accompanying book, Golden Pages, Volume 3. There you will also find the story again in written form, placed in its historical context and supplemented with background on Franz Kafka and his time. You will find the link in the description. And if you like, we will listen to each other again tomorrow on Sleepy Classic Tales. Good night.